material, luminous, and transparent disks. If stars are all distant planets or suns, how is it that various phenomena have been observed including stars changing color, intensity of light, sudden appearance, disappearance, or shooting quickly from one place to another? I have watched single stars changing their colors as regularly as a disco ball, others shooting through the sky and disappearing, and stranger still, I once saw a star shoot quickly straight upwards through the sky for 2 seconds and then stop again. Back in the late 16th century, when the heliocentric theory was starting to take hold over the imaginations of an unsuspecting public, Danish astronomer Tycho Brahe famously argued for geocentricity, positing that if the Earth revolved in an orbit around the Sun, the change in relative position of the stars after 6 months of orbital motion could not fail to be seen. The stars should seem to separate as we approach and come together as we recede. In actual fact, however, after 190 million miles of supposed orbit around the Sun, not a single inch of parallax can be detected in the stars. Thomas Winship said, "In the time of Tycho Brahe it was said that the Earth revolved around the Sun, but he argued that if the Earth revolved around the Sun, the relative position of the stars would change very much, and the matter must, in the nature of the case, be easily detected. Accordingly, experiments were tried at intervals of 6 months, and the result showed that the stars were in exactly the same position as they had occupied 6 months before, thus proving that the Earth does not move at all. If the Earth is at a given point in space on, say, January 1st, and according to its present-day science at a distance of 190 million miles from that point 6 months afterwards, it follows that the relative position and directions of the stars will have greatly changed, however small the angle of parallax may be. That this great change is nowhere apparent and has never been observed incontestably proves that the Earth is at rest, that it does not move in an orbit around the Sun." When Tycho Brahe demonstrated that after 190 million miles of supposed orbit around the Sun, not a single inch of parallax could be detected, heliocentrists, desperate to patch the glaring hole in their theory, pushed their hypothetical distances to the stars into the trillions of miles, claiming the closest one, Proxima Centauri, was a ludicrous 25 trillion miles away, and thereby making all the stars so conveniently far that no appreciable parallax could be detected. This expedient explanation, which heliocentrists have clung to ever since, has proven satisfactory to silence the manipulated minds of the masses, but still fails to adequately account for several issues. Dr. Samuel Robotham wrote, "It is found by observation that the stars come to the meridian about 4 minutes earlier every 24 hours than the Sun, taking the solar time as the standard. This makes 120 minutes every 30 days, and 24 hours in the year. Hence all the constellations have passed before or in advance of the Sun in that time. This is the simple fact as observed in nature, but the theory of rotundity and motion on axes and in an orbit has no place for it. Visible truth must be ignored because this theory stands in the way and prevents its votaries from understanding it." William Carpenter said, "Considerably more than 1,000,000 Earths would be required to make up a body like the Sun, the astronomers tell us, and more than 53,000 suns would be wanted to equal the cubic contents of the star Vega. And Vega is a small star, and there are countless millions of these stars, and it takes 30 million years for the light of some of those stars to reach us at 12 million miles in a minute. And, says Mr. Proctor, I think a moderate estimate of the age of the Earth would be 500 million years. Its weight, says the same individual, is 6 heptillion tons. Now, since no human being is able to comprehend these things, the giving of them to the world is an insult, an outrage, and though they have all risen from the one assumption, that Earth is a planet, instead of upholding the assumption, they drag it down by the weight of their own absurdity and leave it lying in the dust, a proof that the Earth is not a globe. Several experiments have since been performed and repeated by notable scientists like Albert Michelson, Edward Morley, George Airy, and George Sagnac, proving that it is the stars that revolve around a stationary Earth and not the other way around. The conclusive results of their experiments are not contested or even mentioned in modern astronomy books. Rather, they are conveniently swept under the carpet to keep prying minds from seeing through the lies. For example, the experiment known as Airy's failure, since it failed to prove heliocentricity, involved filling a telescope with water to slow the speed of light inside. Usually, telescopes must be slightly tilted to get starlight down the axis of the tube, supposedly due to Earth's speed around the sun. Airy discovered that actually the starlight was already coming in at the correct angle, so no change was necessary. This demonstrated that the stars move relative to a stationary Earth and not the other way around, because if it was the telescope moving, he would have to change the angle. Gabrielle Henriette said, "All the planets, including the Sun, revolve around the Earth. These circumstances cannot be denied since they are plainly visible, either in the ordinary way with the naked eye or with the help of the telescope. It can be said, in this connection, that in the case of a science which should be based exclusively on observation and not on speculation, such as astronomy, the evidence of the senses is the only factor upon which conclusions can and must be based. If the planets can be seen revolving around the Earth, it is for the decisive factor that they do revolve in such a way. It is asserted that this is not so, and it is maintained that the Earth and the planets revolve round the Sun. We note with astonishment, however, the bizarre and definitely suspicious fact that these planetary movements are not visible. They cannot be seen, and yet they are called real. How can these movements be proved and their speed be ascertained, since they are invisible? On the other hand, the existing geocentric planetary motions which can be observed and measured, and which consequently constitute a perfectly valid system, are condemned as unreal and apparent. A pertinent remark may incidentally be made on the subject. Why do the astronomical tables which are published year after year give the so-called apparent movements of the planets in the zodiac? Why take the trouble of calculating and putting them on record at all if they are not real? Why is it also that no mention is made of the so-called real movements of the planets?" Marshall Hall said, "Trust your eyes and your cameras. They have no reason to deceive you about whether the stars are going around you nightly. Then get it in your mind. This single fact surrounding star trails that has been photographed thousands of times and cannot be denied must be explained away by the theoretical science establishment. All of the factless allegations, a rotating and orbiting Earth, billions of light-year distances to the stars, a 15-billion-year-old universe, the whole Big Bang paradigm, all of the alleged evolution of the universe, Earth, and mankind, that is to say, all of modern evolution-based cosmology controlling knowledge today, all of it, is completely undone if the stars are doing what cameras show they are doing, namely, going around the Earth nightly. If you can do so for a few minutes, just lay aside the Copernican indoctrination that accompanies such pictures, and take a good hard look at these photographs of something that really, really happens every single night. Do you see what I see? I see all the visible stars in the northern skies going around the North Star in perfect circles. In other words, I see all the stars which these time exposures have recorded actually going around that navigational star that God put there for us in the northern hemisphere." Thomas Winship said, "The plurality of worlds is based on assumptions so contrary to known possibilities that the grand idea must be thrown into the waste paper basket. The supposed great distance of the sun from the earth is the main cause of the delusions of the learned as to the so-called worlds above us being inhabited. This distance is based on a fictitious idea, that of the revolution of the earth round the sun, which I have already shown to be unconditionally false. The sun is a small body of light and near the earth, therefore all the star distances are wrong, their sizes and all other suppositions. The plurality of worlds is only the logical sequence of belief if the earth be a rapidly revolving globe, but this has been shown to be ridiculous in the extreme. Evidence, apart from any theory, has been presented which entirely nullifies such an assumption and renders it absurd, showing that such an unnatural idea has not a vestige of natural fact to support it. The grand doctrine of the plurality of worlds, therefore, like all of the other grand doctrines of modern astronomy, must be consigned to oblivion. When it can be shown that this world is a globe, and by what known principle the inhabitants can hang onto the swinging ball, like the housefly crawls along the ceiling, it will be quite time enough to talk about the plurality of worlds." In other words, the plurality of worlds, if there's supposed to be many, many ball planets spinning around in this infinite universe, that only makes sense in the heliocentric spinning ball cosmology. It's been shown that the Earth is flat and motionless, so the idea that there are many other Earth-like planets out there, or there are many other ball habitations spinning around in the sky, is ridiculous. You can see with a telescope that the things that they call planets look exactly like the things that they call stars, and before they started calling them planets, they were called stars. They were called wandering stars. If the planets are supposed to be masses like Earth, why is it that their starlight is often brighter than the other stars, which they claim are suns? Why would they have light at all? It's the same like with the moon. They claim to land on the moon, and they show this desert planet, but we look up at the moon and see a shining light coming from this disk. If the moon is so bright, shining with light like that, why weren't the astronauts constantly illuminated by this huge light that shines all the way 238,000 miles to the Earth? But then when they're on the moon, it's just dirt. When you look at these things through an actual telescope, they just look like disks of light. They don't look at all like suns or like ball planets. And when you take a good look at what NASA is feeding you, it's CGI. All the ball planets, every shot that NASA shows of Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, did I miss any? All these things, all their pictures of these planets are clearly made on a computer. They are CGI, computer graphic images, computer generated images. So, the idea that there are many other spinning ball planets out there in the sky is false. NASA doesn't do science. NASA does science fiction. Heliocentricity is not science. It's science fiction. Geocentricity is what you actually experience. It's what actually happens. The flat Earth is what you actually experience. You do not experience a curve. You do not experience motion. You don't feel yourself moving 1,000 miles an hour. The stars don't change their relative positions. They're fixed because they're revolving around us just as it appears. Think about it. If we were revolving around the sun, and the sun revolving around the galaxy, and the galaxy revolving around the universe, guess what? All the stars would change their position every single night. You wouldn't be able to catch the same star trails 2 consecutive nights, let alone for hundreds and hundreds of years, not changing positions. If you had those 4 different motions, everything spiraling around each other, you can't have the North Star fixed and all the other stars fixed in their constellations revolving perfect circles around it. It can't happen. You couldn't even have perfect circle star trails. They would be spirals. They would be awkward spirals. They would be like elliptical spirals. So, point is, Earth is not a planet. It's a plane. They just added a T to the end and fooled everyone. And then they started saying, there's 1 septillion other planets too, just like Earth. And then once they got people believing that, now they're saying, and there must be life on some of those. So there's aliens. And now they're preparing you for aliens. That's what's coming next. They want you to believe in aliens. They want you to believe that there's some off-world enemy or friend that's going to come here to save or destroy us, and they're going to use that as a false flag event to further their agenda. It's been in the works for a long time, so this is a big one. You could even say that this is the purpose of the Ball Earth deception. What's the purpose? To create a world religion. What do you think NASA is? What do you think the spinning ball Earth, universe, Big Bang, evolution bullshit is? It's a religion. People believe this shit and it doesn't exist. So, well, why did they lie about the flat Earth, Eric? Because they're making you believe in a bullshit science fiction religion. That's why. You don't even know that you're in a cult. You don't know that you've been brainwashed. And how deeply you've been brainwashed. You've been brainwashed so much that instead of thinking that you come from a intelligent consciousness, You think that you come from nothing, and monkeys. They brainwash you to think that you and Earth aren't special or unique, but that there's just infinite Earths and worlds and beings, and humans are not the most intelligent of the intelligent designers' designs. They want you to believe that there's some aliens out there, more intelligent. They want you to believe that they're more intelligent than you, because only they have the Hubble Space Telescope, and only they have all the technology necessary to tell you that, oh, stars are really suns, and the wandering stars are planets, and oh, we found water on Mars with our little probe rover thing. Check out these CGI images we sent back on our million-mile internet connection that we have, but you don't, and you've never seen anywhere. Think about how effective this religion is. It's worldwide. It is a world religion. They have successfully created a worldwide religion and made people the whole world over believe in it. They teach it to them in government schools, and they're so indoctrinated into this religion, they have no idea that it's a religion. That's the point. They call it science. They have no idea that they're in a cult being brainwashed by a bunch of CGI pictures and fairy tales. So why the flat earth deception? It's the most successful religious indoctrination in history. That's why. Around the turn of the 20th century, in order to save the dying heliocentric model from the conclusive experiments of Airy, Michelson, Morley, Gale, Sagnac, Cantor, Nordmeyer, and others, Albert Einstein created his special theory of relativity, a brilliant revision of heliocentrism which in one philosophical swoop banished the universal ether from scientific study, replacing it with a form of relativism which allowed for heliocentrism and geocentrism to hold equal merit. If there is no absolute etheric medium within which all things exist, then hypothetically one can postulate complete relativism with regard to the movement of two objects, such as the Earth and Sun. At the time, the Michelson-Morley and Michelson-Gale experiments had already long measured and proven the existence of the ether, but the Church of Heliocentrism was not to be deterred. Einstein never tried to refute the experiments scientifically, choosing instead to object philosophically with his notion of absolute relativity, claiming that all uniform motion is relative, and there exists no absolute state of rest anywhere in the universe. Nowadays, just like the theory of heliocentrism, Einstein's theory of relativity is accepted worldwide as gospel truth, even though he himself admitted geocentrism is equally justifiable. Albert Einstein said, "The struggle so violent in the early days of science between the views of Ptolemy and Copernicus would be quite meaningless. Either coordinate system could be used with equal justification. The two sentences, 'the sun is at rest and the earth moves,' or 'the sun moves and the earth is at rest,' would simply mean two different conventions concerning two different coordinate systems." George Ellis said, "People need to be aware that there is a range of models that could explain the observations. For instance, I can construct you a spherically symmetrical universe with Earth at its center, and you cannot disprove it based on observations. You can only exclude it on philosophical grounds. In my view, there is absolutely nothing wrong in that. What I want to bring into the open is the fact that we are using philosophical criteria in choosing our models. A lot of cosmology tries to hide that." Einstein's necessary modification to the heliocentric theory ultimately resulted in transforming it into the acentric theory of the universe, because the sun was no longer the center of anything, and all motion was only relative. Acentrists soon began postulating that not only is the Earth spinning 1,000 miles per hour and revolving 67,000 miles per hour around the sun, but the Earth, Sun, and entire solar system as a whole are simultaneously rotating around the Milky Way galaxy at 500,000 miles per hour. Furthermore, the entire galaxy with the Earth, Sun, and entire solar system are also simultaneously shooting 670 million miles per hour through the universe away from a Big Bang explosion at the beginning of time. E. Eschini said, "The theory of the three, now four, Motions of the earth and subsequent relativity is the result of trying to cover up one lie by another. They say that as we whirl in London at the rate of nearly 11 miles a minute, we are shooting into space around the sun at nearly 20 miles a second, and the sun itself moves around a point in space at the immense speed of 150 million miles in a year, pulling our poor Earth with him at the added speed, the distance that separates us from the sun, and in this maddening whirlwind of motions they try to apply Euclid's spherical trigonometry to locate distances, which data was intended by Euclid to determine fixed points only, with the result that they have brought out wild calculations which have been fostered dogmatically on a gullible world, but are about as infallible as the utterances of Borgia. When Einstein first introduced his theory of relativity to the world, he often used the analogy of a wagon rolling along the street as an illustration. What we mean by relative motion, he stated in a Princeton University lecture, in a general sense, is perfectly plain to everyone. If we think of a wagon moving along a street, we know that it is possible to speak of the wagon at rest and the street in motion, just as well as it is to speak of the wagon in motion and the street at rest. That, however, is a very special part of the ideas involved in the principle of relativity. Gerard Hickson says, "That would be amusing if we read it in a comic paper, but when Professor Einstein says it in a lecture at Princeton University, we are expected not to laugh. That is the only difference. It is silly, but I may not dismiss the matter with that remark, and so I will answer quite seriously that it is only possible for me to speak of the street moving while the wagon remains still, and to believe it, when I cast away all the experience of a lifetime and am no longer able to understand the evidence of my senses, which is insanity. Such self-deception as this is not reasoning, it is the negation of reason, which is the faculty of forming correct conclusions from things observed, judged by the light of experience. It is unworthy of our intelligence and a waste of our greatest gift, but that introduction serves very well to illustrate the kind of illusion that lies at the root of relativity. When he suggested that the street might be moving, while the wagon with its wheels revolving was standing still, he was asking us to imagine that in a similar manner the earth we stand upon might be moving, while the stars that pass in the night stand still. It is a case of appeal, where Einstein appeals in the name of a convicted Copernican astronomy against the judgment of Michelson, Morley, Nordemeyer, physics, fact, experience, observation, and reason. On the surface, relativity may seem plausible enough, especially when presented by a charismatic character of Einstein's caliber, but is it really so simple and straightforward? In fact, Einstein's theory of relativity is so complicated and convoluted that when it first came to the public's attention, it was said that there were probably less than a dozen people on Earth capable of understanding it. After Einstein presented his theory to the Royal Astronomical Society, philanthropist Eugene Higgins offered a prize of $5,000 for the best explanation of relativity in essay form, describing it so the general public could understand what it was all about. Prize winner Mr. L. Bolton himself admitted that even when stated in its simplest form, it remains a tough proposition. Along with Einstein's denial of the ether and anything absolute, except the absoluteness of relativity, he had to create a litany of new terms and ideas, each depending upon another and contributing to support the whole. For example, Einstein claimed that there was no ether, that time is a fourth spatial dimension, that infinity and eternity do not exist, and that light is a material thing. This meant that time must be added to the three dimensions of length, breadth, and thickness, that space be renamed a continuum, and points in the space-time continuum be renamed to events. Gerard Hickson said, "What we have always known as a point in the terms of Euclid, Einstein calls an event. But if words have any meaning, a point and an event are two totally different things, for a point is a mark, a spot or place, and is only concerned in the consideration of material things, while an event is an occurrence, it is something that happens. There is as much difference between them as there is between the sentence, 'This is a barrel of apples,' and 'These apples came from New Zealand.'" While claiming time as a fourth dimension, Einstein explains that by dimension we must understand merely one of four independent quantities which locate an event in space. This is to imply that the other three dimensions which are in common use are independent quantities, which is not the case, for length, breadth, and thickness are essentially found in combination. They coexist in each and every physical thing so that they are related. Hence they are not independent quantities. On the contrary, time is an independent quantity. It is independent of any one or all the three proportions of material things. It is not in any way related, and therefore cannot be used as a fourth dimension. Einstein's theory of relativity claims that light is a material thing which therefore has weight and is subject to gravity. This idea meant starlight could now bend under its own weight and curve its path based on the distance and mass of objects along with its trajectory, which allowed heliocentrists like Einstein to claim stars are in reality not where they appear to be, and that with his new geometry the stars must be moved to much farther away than previously assumed. Einstein's law of the constancy of the velocity of light states that light always travels at the same speed, 186,414 miles per second, or 671,900,400 miles per hour. But Einstein also claims that gravity causes light to bend towards massive objects along its trajectory. If a ray of light can be said to bend, curve, or deviate from its course due to the gravitational pull of masses in its path, it must by necessity accelerate when approaching and decelerate when receding from these things. However, if light can bend under its own weight, or under the law of gravitation as Einstein claims it does, then it is not, and cannot be, absolute. Gerard Hickson says, strangely enough, while Einstein claims that everything is in motion and nothing is stable, he allows one thing, and one thing only, to remain outside the realm of relativity, independent of everything else. He claims that the velocity of light is constant under all circumstances, and therefore is absolute. This is a blunder of the first magnitude, but I do not imagine that he fell into it through an oversight, for it is quite evident that he was driven into this false position. He was compelled to say that the velocity of light is constant, because if he did not, his new geometry would be useless. We are told that light is a material thing, and that a beam of light is deflected from a straight line by the gravitation of any and everything that lies near its course as it passes within their sphere of influence. And we are further assured that light always maintains a uniform speed of 186,414 miles per second. We have, however, to remind Professor Einstein that this was determined as the result of experiments by the physicists Fizeau, Foucault, Cornu, Michelson, and Newcomb, all of which experiments were conducted within the Earth's atmosphere, on terra firma. In all these experiments, a ray of light was reflected between two mirrors several miles apart, so that it had to pass to and fro, always through the atmosphere, and it is not to be supposed that light or anything else can travel at the same speed through the air as it would through the vacuum Einstein supposes space to be. Let us reverse this in order to realize it better. It is not to be supposed that any material thing travels at no greater speed through a vacuum than it does through air, which has a certain amount of density or opacity. If anything does not distinguish the difference between air and a vacuum, then it is not a material thing. It cannot be matter. On the other hand, anything that is matter must, of necessity, make such a distinction, and in that case, its velocity cannot be constant. Conventional wisdom before Einstein's theory was that light was not a material thing, that it discharged in a straight line in every direction from the source, that it could not be influenced by gravity, could not bend, curve, or be deflected from its course by anything. As Lord Kelvin said, light diverges from a luminous center outwards in all directions. Its velocity may be affected according to the density of the medium through which it passes, but this fact simply proves Einstein's law of the constancy of the velocity of light is incorrect. Gerard Hickson said, "The length of the course used by Newcomb in the final determination of the velocity of light was 7.44242 kilometers. If the ray of light had deviated by a hair's breadth from an absolutely straight line, it never could have passed through the interstices between the very fine teeth of his revolving wheel, or return precisely to the appointed spot on his sending and receiving mirrors, which were 3.72121 kilometers apart. The fact that the ray of light did pass from mirror to mirror, and through the wheel, proves that it maintained a straight line, hence it is certain that it was not deflected from its course by the gravitation of the earth between the two mirrors, wherefore it is obvious that it was not affected by gravitation. So we find that the very experiments by which the accepted 186,414 miles per second as the velocity of light was measured, experiments which were carried out with the utmost painstaking and minute attention to detail, prove that a ray of light is not influenced by the gravitation of the earth in the slightest degree. Therefore, if those experiments were good enough to warrant all the world in accepting the velocity of light, they may be equally well adduced as proof that a ray of light does not bend by its own weight, and that light is not affected by gravitation. Relativity is clever, but it belongs to the same category as Newton's law of gravitation and the Kant-Herschel-Laplace nebular hypothesis, in as far as it is a superfine effort of the imagination seeking to maintain an impossible theory of the universe in defiance of every fact against it. And Robert Sugenis said, "As for Einstein, if you want to believe that lengths shrink when an object moves, time changes in the process, and its mass increases, just so you can explain the anomalies of Michelson's experiment, that's your privilege. But I'd just as soon answer it by saying that mass, time, and length stay the same, and the Earth isn't moving, and I'm just as scientific as you for saying so." If you fill a balloon with helium, a substance lighter than the nitrogen, oxygen, and other elements which compose the air around it, the balloon will immediately fly upwards. If you fill a balloon with hydrogen, a substance even lighter than helium, the balloon will fly upwards even faster. If you blow a dandelion seed out of your hands, a substance just barely heavier than the air, it will float away and slowly but eventually fall to the ground. And if you drop an anvil from your hands, something much heavier than the air, it will quickly and directly fall straight to the ground. Now this has absolutely nothing to do with gravity. The fact that light things rise up and heavy things fall down is simply a natural property of weight and density. That is very different from gravity. Gravity is a hypothetical magnetic-like force possessed by large masses which Isaac Newton needed to help explain the heliocentric theory of the universe. Lady Blunt says, "Most people in England have either read or heard that Sir Isaac Newton's theory of gravitation was originated by his seeing an apple fall to the earth from a tree in his garden. Persons gifted with ordinary common sense would say that the apple fell down to earth because, bulk for bulk, it was heavier than the surrounding air. But if, instead of the apple, a fluffy feather had been detached from the tree, a breeze would probably have sent the feather floating away, and the feather would not reach the earth until the surrounding air became so still that, by virtue of its own density, the feather would fall to the ground." Wilbur Voliva, a famous flat earther in the early 20th century, gave lectures all over America against Newtonian astronomy. He would begin by walking on stage with a book, a balloon, a feather, and a brick, and ask the audience, "How is it that a law of gravitation can pull up a toy balloon and cannot put up a brick? I throw up this book. Why doesn't it go on up? That book went up as far as the force behind it forced it, and it fell because it was heavier than the air, and that is the only reason. I cut the string of a toy balloon. It rises, gets to a certain height, and then it begins to settle. I take this brick and a feather. I blow the feather. Yonder it goes. Finally, it begins to settle and comes down. This brick goes up as far as the force forces it, and then it comes down because it is heavier than the air. That is all." David Wardlaw Scott says, "Any object which is heavier than the air, and which is unsupported, has a natural tendency to fall by its own weight. Newton's famous apple at Woolsthorpe, or any other apple when ripe, loses hold of its stalk, and being heavier than the air, drops as a matter of necessity to the ground, totally irrespective of any attraction of the earth. For if such attraction existed, why does not the earth attract the rising smoke, which is not nearly so heavy as the apple? The answer is simple, because the smoke is lighter than the air, and therefore does not fall but ascends. Gravitation is only a subterfuge employed by Newton in his attempt to prove that the earth revolves around the sun, and the quicker it is relegated to the tomb of all the Capulets, the better will it be for all classes of society. Thomas Winship says, "The law of gravitation is said by the advocates of the Newtonian system of astronomy to be the greatest discovery of science, and the foundation of the whole of modern astronomy. If, therefore, it can be shown that gravitation is a pure assumption, and an imagination of the mind only, that it has no existence outside of the brains of its expounders and advocates, the whole of the hypothesis of this modern so-called science fall to the ground as flat as the surface of the ocean, and this most exact of all sciences, this wonderful feat of the intellect, becomes at once the most ridiculous superstition and the most gigantic imposture to which ignorance and credulity could ever be exposed." Einstein's theory of relativity and the entire heliocentric model of the universe hinge upon Newton's law of gravitation. Heliocentrists claim that the sun is the most massive object in the heavens, more massive even than the earth, and therefore the earth and other planets, by law, are caught up in the sun's gravity and forced to orbit perpetual circles and ellipses around it. They claim that gravity also somehow allows people, buildings, the oceans, and all of nature to exist on the underside of their ball earth without falling off. Now, even if gravity did exist, why would it cause both planets to orbit the sun and people to stick to the earth? Gravity should either cause people to float in suspended circular orbits around the earth, or it should cause the earth to be pulled and crashed into the sun. What sort of magic is gravity that it can glue people's feet to the ball earth while causing earth itself to revolve ellipses around the sun? The two effects are very different, yet the same cause is attributed to both. Furthermore, this magnetic-like attraction of massive objects gravity is purported to have can be found nowhere in the natural world. There is no example in nature of a massive sphere or any other shaped object which, by virtue of its mass alone, causes smaller objects to stick to or orbit around it. There is nothing on Earth massive enough that it can be shown to cause even a dust bunny to stick to or orbit around it. Try spinning a wet tennis ball or any other spherical object with smaller things placed on its surface, and you will find that everything falls or flies off, and nothing sticks to or orbits around it. To claim the existence of a physical law without a single practical, evidential example is hearsay, not science. Lady Blunt and Albert Smith wrote, "That bodies in some instances are seen to approach each other is a fact, but that their mutual approach is due to an attraction or pulling process on the part of these bodies is, after all, a mere theory. Hypotheses may sometimes be admissible, but when they are invented to support other hypotheses, they are not only to be doubted, but discredited and discarded. The hypothesis of a universal force called gravitation is based upon, and was indeed invented with a view to support another hypothesis, namely that the earth and sea together make up a vast globe whirling away through space, and therefore needing some force or forces to guide it in its mad career, and so control it as to make it conform to what is called its annual orbit round the sun. The theory, first of all, makes the earth to be a globe, then not a perfect globe, but an oblate spheroid, flattened at the poles, then more oblate, until it was in danger of becoming so flattened that it would be like a cheese, and passing over minor variations of form, we are finally told that the earth is pear-shaped, and that the ellipsoid has been replaced by an apoid. What shape it may assume next, we cannot tell. It will depend upon the whim or fancy of some astute and speculating scientist. How is it that gravity is so strong that it can hold all the oceans, buildings, and people stuck to the underside of the ball earth, but so weak that it allows birds, bugs, smoke, and balloons to casually evade its grips completely? How is it that gravity holds our bodies clung to the underside of a ball earth, but yet we can easily raise our legs and arms, walk or jump, and feel no such constant downward pulling force? How is it that gravity can cause planets to revolve elliptical orbits around a single center of attraction? Ellipses by nature require two foci, and the force of gravitation would have to regularly increase and decrease to keep planets in constant orbit and prevent pulling them into direct collision courses. Thomas Winship says, that the sun's path is an exact circle for only about 4 periods in a year, and then of only a few hours at the equinoxes and solstices, completely disproves the might have been of circular gravitation, and by consequence all of gravitation. If the sun were of sufficient power to retain the earth in its orbit when nearest the sun, when the earth arrived at that part of its elliptical path farthest from the sun, the attractive force, unless very greatly increased, would be utterly incapable of preventing the earth rushing away into space in a right line forever, as astronomers say. On the other hand, it is equally clear that if the sun's attraction were just sufficient to keep the earth in its proper path when farthest from the sun, and thus to prevent it rushing off into space, the same power of attraction when the earth was nearest the sun would be so much greater that, unless the attraction were very greatly diminished, nothing would prevent the earth rushing towards and being absorbed by the sun, there being no counterbalancing focus to prevent such a catastrophe. As astronomy makes no reference to the increase and diminution of the attractive force of the sun, called gravitation, for the above necessary purposes, we are again forced to the conclusion that the great discovery of which astronomers are so proud is absolutely non-existent. And N. Crossland says, "We are asked by the Newtonian to believe that the action of gravitation, which we can easily overcome by the slightest exercise of volition in raising a hand or foot, is so overwhelmingly violent when we lose our balance and fall a distance of a few feet, that this force, which is imperceptible under usual conditions, may, under extraordinary circumstances, cause the fracture of every limb we possess. Common sense must reject this interpretation. Gravitation does not furnish a satisfactory explanation of the phenomena here described, whereas the definition of weight already given does, for a body seeking in the readiest manner its level of stability would produce precisely the result experienced. If the influence which kept us securely attached to this earth were identical with that which is powerful enough to disturb a distant planet in its orbit, we should be more immediately conscious of its masterful presence and potency, whereas this influence is so impotent in the very spot where it is supposed to be most dominant that we find an insurmountable difficulty in accepting the idea of its existence." Heliocentrists claim the ball Earth is perpetually spinning on its axis at a mind-numbing 1,038 miles per hour, or 19 miles per second, and somehow people, animals, buildings, oceans, and other surface phenomena can stick to the underside of the spinning ball without falling or flying off. Take a ride on the gravitron at your local amusement park, however, and notice how the faster it spins, the more you are pushed away from the center of spin, not towards it. Even if the centripetal, inward pulling force of gravity did exist, which it does not, the centrifugal, outward pushing force of the ball Earth's supposed 19-mile-per-second spin would also exist and have to be overcome, yet neither of these opposing forces have ever been shown to have any existence outside the imaginations of heliocentric scientists. David Wardlaw Scott says, "We are not like flies which, by the peculiar formation of their feet, can crawl on a ball, but we are human beings who require a plane surface on which to walk, and how could we be fastened to the earth whirling, according to your theory, around the sun, at the rate of 19 miles per second? The famed law of gravitation will not avail, though we are told that we have 15 pounds of atmosphere pressing on every square inch of our bodies, but this does not appear to be particularly logical, for there are many athletes who can leap nearly their own height, and run a mile in less than 5 minutes, which they could not possibly do if they were thus handicapped." And Crossland says, "The attraction of gravitation is said to be stronger at the surface of the earth than at a distance from it. Is it so? If I spring upwards perpendicularly, I cannot with all my might ascend more than 4 feet from the ground. But if I jump in a curve with a low trajectory, keeping my highest elevation about 3 feet, I might clear a bound of space above the earth of about 18 feet, so that practically I can overcome the so-called force, pull, at the distance of 4 feet, in the proportion of 18 to 4, being the very reverse of what I ought to be able to do according to the Newtonian hypothesis." Newton also theorized, and it is now commonly taught, that the Earth's ocean tides are caused by gravitational lunar attraction. If the moon is only 2,160 miles in diameter, and the Earth 8,000 miles, however, Using their own math and law, it follows that the Earth is 87 times more massive, and therefore the larger body should attract the smaller to it, and not the other way around. If the Earth's greater gravity is what keeps the Moon in orbit, it is impossible for the Moon's lesser gravity to supersede the Earth's gravity at Earth's sea level, where its gravitational attraction would even further outtrump the Moon's. Not to mention the velocity and path of the Moon are uniform, and should therefore exert a uniform influence on the Earth's tides, when in actuality the Earth's tides vary greatly. Furthermore, if ocean tides are caused by Moon's gravitation, how is it that lakes, ponds, and other smaller bodies of standing water remain outside the Moon's grasp, while the gigantic oceans are so affected? Thomas Winship says, "If the Moon lifted up the water, it is evident that near the land the water would be drawn away and low instead of high tide caused. Again, the velocity and path of the Moon are uniform, and it follows that if she exerted any influence on the Earth, that influence could only be a uniform influence. But the tides are not uniform. At Port Natal the rise and fall is about 6 feet, while at Beira, about 600 miles up the coast, the rise and fall is 26 feet. This effectually settles the matter that the Moon has no influence on the tides. Tides are caused by the gentle and gradual rise and fall of the earth on the bosom of the mighty deep. In inland lakes there are no tides, which also proves that the Moon cannot attract either the earth or water to cause tides, but the fact that the basin of the lake is on the earth, which rests on the waters of the deep, shows that no tides are possible, as the waters of the lakes together with the earth rise and fall, and thus the tides at the coast are caused, while there are no tides on waters unconnected with the sea." Samuel Rowbotham says, "It is affirmed that the intensity of attraction increases with proximity and vice versa. How then, when the waters are drawn up by the Moon from their bed and away from the Earth's attraction, which at that greater distance from the center is considerably diminished, while that of the Moon is proportionally increased, how is it possible that all the waters acted on should be prevented leaving the Earth and flying away to the Moon? If the Moon has power of attraction sufficient to lift the waters of Earth at all, even a single inch from their deepest receptacles, where the Earth's attraction is much greater, there is nothing in the theory of attraction of gravitation to prevent her taking to herself all the waters which came within her influence. Let the smaller body once overcome the power of the larger, and the power of the smaller becomes greater than when it first operated, because the matter acted on is nearer to it. Proximity is greater, and therefore power is greater. How then can the waters of the ocean immediately underneath the Moon flow towards the shores, and so cause a flood tide? Water flows, it is said, through the law of gravity or attraction of the Earth's center. Is it possible then for the Moon, having once overcome the power of the Earth, to let go her hold upon the waters through the influence of a power which she has conquered, and which therefore is less than her own? The above and other difficulties which exist in connection with the explanation of the tides afforded by the Newtonian system have led many, including Sir Isaac Newton himself, to admit that such explanation is the least satisfactory portion of the theory of gravitation. Thus we have been carried forward by the sheer force of evidence to the conclusion that the tides of the sea do not arise from the attraction of the Moon, but simply from the rising and falling of the floating earth in the waters of the great deep. That calmness which is found to exist at the bottom of the great seas could not possibly be if the waters were alternately raised by the Moon and pulled down by the earth." David Wardlaw Scott says, "Even Sir Isaac Newton himself confessed that the explanation of Moon's action on the tides was the least satisfactory part of his theory. This theory asserts that the larger objects attract the smaller, and the mass of the Moon being reckoned as only 1/8 of that of the Earth, it follows that if, by the presumed force of gravitation, the Earth revolves around the Sun, much more for the same reason should the Moon do so likewise, instead of which that wilful orb still continues to go round our world. Tides vary greatly in height, owing chiefly to the different configurations of the adjoining lands. At Chepstow it rises to 60 feet, at Portishead to 50, while at Dublin Bay it is but 12, and at Wexford only 5 feet. That the earth itself has a slight tremulous motion may be seen in the movement of the spirit level, even when fixed as steadily as possible, and that the sea has a fluctuation may be witnessed by the oscillation of an anchored ship in the calmest day of summer. By what means the tides are so regularly affected is at present only conjectured. Possibly it may be by atmospheric pressure on the waters of the great deep, and perhaps even the moon itself, as suggested by the late Dr. Robotham, may influence the atmosphere, increasing or diminishing its barometric pressure, and indirectly the rise and fall of Earth in the waters. Samuel Robotham says, bearing this fact in mind that there exists a continual pressure of the atmosphere upon the Earth, and associating it with the fact that the Earth is a vast plain stretched out upon the waters, and it will be seen that it must of necessity slightly fluctuate or slowly rise and fall in the water. As by the action of the atmosphere the Earth is slowly depressed, the water moves towards the receding shore and produces the flood tide, and when by the reaction of the resisting ocean medium the Earth gradually ascends and the waters recede, and the ebb tide is produced. This is the general cause of tides. Whatever peculiarities are observed, they may be traced to the reaction of channels, bays, headlands, and other local causes. That the Earth has a vibratory or tremulous motion, such as must necessarily belong to a floating and fluctuating structure, is abundantly proved by the experience of astronomers and surveyors. If a delicate spirit level be firmly placed upon a rock or upon the most solid foundation which it is possible to construct, the very curious phenomenon will be observed of constant change in the position of the air bubble. However carefully the level may be adjusted and the instrument protected from the atmosphere, the bubble will not maintain its position many seconds together. A somewhat similar influence has been noticed in astronomical observatories, where instruments of the best construction and placed in the most approved positions cannot always be relied upon without occasional readjustment. In the past several decades, NASA has shown video of astronauts supposedly in low Earth orbit experiencing complete weightlessness or zero gravity. How is this weightless effect achieved if gravity doesn't exist? As it turns out, for the past several decades, NASA, together with Boeing, have been perfecting so-called zero-G planes and zero-G maneuvers, which are able to produce weightlessness at any altitude. Aboard modified Boeing 727s, specially trained pilots perform aerobatic maneuvers known as parabolas. Planes climb with a pitch angle of 45 degrees using engine thrust and elevator controls. Then, when maximum height is reached, the craft is pointed downward at high speed. The period of weightlessness begins while ascending and lasts all the way up and over the parabola until reaching a downward pitch angle of 30 degrees, at which point the maneuver is repeated. Therefore, all NASA's footage of astronauts aboard space shuttles or the International Space Station can be easily hoaxed and simulated in Earth atmosphere aboard a zero-G plane. In fact, watching footage of zero-G plane flights alongside footage of NASA astronauts, supposedly floating around their space shuttles and space stations, no observable difference can be seen between the two. Astronomers claim to have measured all the planets' distances, shapes, orbits, weights, relative positions, and times of revolution, all based on the law of gravitation, and without gravity, their entire cosmology folds under its own weight. Without gravity, people cannot stand upside down on a ball Earth. Without gravity, the Earth and planets cannot be revolving around the Sun. Without Newtonian gravitation, Einsteinian relativity, Copernican heliocentricity, and the entire Big Bang Ball Earth mythos cannot exist and falls to pieces. Gravity, both metaphorically and quite literally, just does not hold any water, not as a sound theory of cosmology, and not as a law supposedly responsible for holding in the world's oceans. William Carpenter says, man's experience tells him that he is not constructed like the flies that can live and move upon the ceiling of a room with as much safety as on the floor, and since the modern theory of a planetary Earth necessitates a crowd of theories to keep company with it, and one of them is that men are really bound to the Earth by a force which fastens them to it like needles round a spherical lodestone, a theory perfectly outrageous and opposed to all human experience, it follows that unless we can trample upon common sense and ignore the teachings of experience, we have an evident proof that Earth is not a globe. If we could, after our minds had once been opened to the light of truth, conceive of a globular body on the surface of which human beings could exist, the power, no matter by what name it be called, that would hold them on would then necessarily have to be so constraining and cogent that they could not live. The waters of the oceans would have to be a solid mass, for motion would be impossible. But we not only exist, but live and move, and the water of the oceans skips and dances like a thing of life and beauty. This is a proof that the Earth is not a globe. Gerard Hickson said, "Nearly 100 years ago Kepler suggested that some kind of unknown force must hold the earth and the heavenly bodies in their places, and now Sir Isaac Newton, the greatest mathematician of his age, took up the idea and built the law of gravitation. The name is derived from the Latin word gravis, which means heavy, having weight, while the law of gravitation is defined as that mutual action between masses of matter by virtue of which every such mass tends toward every other with a force varying directly as the product of the masses and inversely as the square of their distances apart. Reduced to simplicity, gravitation is said to be that which attracts everything towards every other thing. That does not tell us much, and yet the little it does tell us is not true, for a thoughtful observer knows very well that every thing is not attracted towards every other thing. The definition implies that it is a force, but it does not say so, for that phrase mutual action is ambiguous and not at all convincing. Gabrielle Henriette says, "The system of gravitation which makes the sun the moving center of the universe, the awkward principles of which are anything but certain since they apply to invisible circumstances so that they cannot be checked, is here replaced by the old geocentric system universally accepted until the 17th century, in view, of course, of its undisputable obviousness, and in which the earth, in a state of immobility and surrounded by the planets visibly moving round it, including the sun, is at the center of our universe. These two facts, which explain almost everything, are firstly the positive existence above the earth of a solid dome constituting the sky, and secondly the non-material nature of the planets and constellations, which are not physical masses, but merely luminous manifestations without substance. These are the two circumstances which lead today to the fundamental transformation of astronomy." And Professor Bernstein, in his Letters to the British Association, writes, "The theory that motions are produced through material attraction is absurd. Attributing such a power to mere matter, which is passive by nature, is a supreme illusion. It is a lovely and easy theory to satisfy any man's mind, but when the practical test comes, it falls all to pieces and becomes one of the most ridiculous theories to common sense and judgment ever conceived." Many people think that modern astronomy's ability to accurately predict lunar and solar eclipses is a result and proof positive of the heliocentric theory of the universe. The fact of the matter, however, is that eclipses have been accurately predicted by cultures worldwide for thousands of years before the heliocentric ball Earth was even a glimmer in Copernicus's imagination. Ptolemy, in the 1st century AD, accurately predicted eclipses for 600 years on the basis of a flat, stationary Earth with equal precision as anyone living today. All the way back in 600 BC, Thales accurately predicted an eclipse which ended the war between the Medes and the Lydians. Eclipses happen regularly with precision in 18-year cycles, so regardless of geocentric or heliocentric, flat or globe Earth cosmologies, eclipses can be accurately calculated independent of such factors. Samuel Rowbotham said, "Those who are unacquainted with the methods of calculating eclipses and other phenomena are prone to look upon the correctness of such calculations as powerful arguments in favor of the doctrine of the earth's rotundity and the Newtonian philosophy generally. One of the most pitiful manifestations of ignorance of the true nature of theoretical astronomy is the ardent inquiry so often made, 'How is it possible for that system to be false which enables its professors to calculate to a second of time both solar and lunar eclipses for hundreds of years to come?' The supposition that such calculations are an essential part of the Newtonian or any other theory is entirely gratuitous and exceedingly fallacious and misleading. Whatever theory is adopted, or if all theories are discarded, the same calculations can be made." Gerard Hickson said, "The Chaldeans used to predict the eclipses 3,000 years ago with a degree of accuracy that is only surpassed by seconds in these days because we have wonderful clocks which they had not. Yet they had an entirely different theory of the universe than we have. The fact is that eclipses occur with a certain exact regularity, just as Christmas and birthdays do, every so many years, days, and minutes, so that anyone who has the records of the eclipses of thousands of years can predict them as well as the best astronomers without any knowledge of their cause." Samuel Rowbotham said, "The simplest method of ascertaining any future eclipse is to take the tables which have been formed during hundreds of years of careful observation, or each observer may form his own tables by collecting a number of old almanacs, one for each of the last 40 years, separate the times of the eclipses in each year, and arrange them in a tabular form. On looking over the various items, he will soon discover parallel cases, or cycles of eclipses, that is, taking the eclipses in the first year of his table, and examining those of each succeeding year, he will notice peculiarities in each year's phenomena, but on arriving to the items of the 19th and 20th years, he will perceive that some of the eclipses in the earlier part of the table will have been now repeated, that is to say, the times and characters will be alike. Tables of the places of the sun and moon, of eclipses, and of kindred phenomena have existed for thousands of years, and were formed independently of each other by the Chaldean, Babylonian, Egyptian, Hindu, Chinese, and other ancient astronomers. Modern science has had nothing to do with these. Another assumption and supposed proof of Earth's shape, heliocentrists claim that lunar eclipses are caused by the shadow of the ball Earth occulting the moon. The idea is that the sun, earth, and moon's spheres perfectly align like 3 billiard balls in a row, so that the sun's light casts the earth's shadow onto the moon. Unfortunately for heliocentrists, this explanation is rendered completely invalid due to the fact that lunar eclipses have happened and continue to happen regularly when both the sun and moon are still visible together above the horizon. For the sun's light to be casting Earth's shadow onto the moon, the three bodies must be aligned in a straight 180-degree syzygy. William Carpenter says, "The Newtonian hypothesis involves the necessity of the sun, in the case of a lunar eclipse, being on the opposite side of a globular Earth to cast its shadow on the moon. But since eclipses of the moon have taken place with both the sun and the moon above the horizon, it follows that it cannot be the shadow of the Earth that eclipses the moon, and that the theory is a blunder." Samuel Rowbotham said, "That the eclipser of the moon is a shadow at all is assumption. No proof whatever is offered. That the moon receives her light from the sun, and that therefore her surface is darkened by the Earth intercepting the sun's light, is not proved. It is not proved that the Earth moves in an orbit round the sun, and therefore by being in different positions, conjunction of sun, earth, and moon, day sometimes occur. The contrary has been clearly proved, that the moon is not eclipsed by a shadow, that she is self-luminous, and not merely a reflector of solar light, and therefore could not possibly be obscured or eclipsed by a shadow from any object whatsoever, and that the Earth is devoid of motion, either on axes or in an orbit through space. Hence, to call that an argument for the Earth's rotundity, where every necessary proposition is only assumed, and in relation to which direct and practical evidence to the contrary is abundant, is to stultify the judgment and every other reasoning faculty." And F.H. Cook wrote, "According to the globular theory, a lunar eclipse occurs when the sun, earth, and moon are in a direct line, but it is on record that since about the 15th century, over 50 eclipses have occurred while both the sun and moon have been visible above the horizon." As early as the time of Pliny, there are records of lunar eclipses happening while both the sun and moon are visible in the sky. The Greenwich Royal Observatory recorded that during the lunar eclipses of July 17, 1590, November 3, 1648, June 16, 1666, and May 26, 1668, the moon rose eclipsed, while the sun was still above the horizon. McCullough's Geography recorded that on September 20th, 1717, and April 20th, 1837, the moon appeared to rise eclipsed before the sun had set. Sir Henry Holland also noted in his Recollections of Past Life the April 20th, 1837 phenomena where the moon rose eclipsed before the sun set. The Daily Telegraph recorded it happening again on January 17, 1870, then again in July of the same year, and it continues to happen during lunar eclipses to this very day. Thomas Winship wrote, "It is alleged by the learned that at a lunar eclipse the Earth casts a shadow on the moon by intercepting the light of the sun. The shadow, it is alleged, is circular, and as only a globe can cast a circular shadow, and as that shadow is cast by the Earth, of course the Earth is a globe. In fact, what better proof could any reasonable person require? Powerful reasoning, says the dupe. Let us see. I have already cited a case where sun and moon have been seen with the moon eclipsed, and as the earth was not between, or they both could not have been seen, the shadow said to be on the moon could not possibly have been cast by the earth. But as refraction is charged with raising the moon above the horizon, when it is said to be really beneath, and the amount of refraction made to tally with what would be required to square the matter, let us see how refraction would act in regard to a shadow.